Hello. Hi. Welcome to Unitary designation. Today I'm going to address a question posted by Simon James on my channel on the general outlines of virtual worlds video. It's a good question, and I figured it deserved more than just a reply. It would make for a whole new video. So hello, Simon James, and anyone else who's watching. It's very cool that you want to engage. That's what YouTube is all about for me. It's just about creative engagement sharing. So that's really cool. Yeah, so clarification-wise, he's correct in pointing out that I use fictional world, virtual world, and real worlds. I don't define them. I just say the terms and assume that people know what they mean. And it's perfectly reasonable to ask for clear dividing lines and how I see them. So I would be able to clarify what those definitions are. So with fictional world, I mean a imagined world, a world where the parameters are based in imagination. Fictional world is very often a recreation of a story in a world that is identical to or similar to ours, besides the events of the story, obviously. That's what makes it fiction. You know, Sherlock Holmes didn't really solve mysteries in London, but the world he inhabits is largely similar to our own. So that would be a fictional world. A fictional world would be anchored in a real world, which is our world. Now, what makes it real? That's a metaphysical question, and sort of an ontological question. It sort of means what you define with the word real, too. So, if you mean real as in metaphysically anchored in itself, then I can't make that guarantee for our world. No one can, technically. But if you use the term more colloquially, as in what we term as having value inherently, like what you do in the real world matters to the extent that you should concern yourself with it, to an extent that you don't do in a fictional world, then yeah, that would be a functional definition for whatever would be real. The world that is given to you by the senses, and the world that you engage in when you interact with other people, either whatever your view happens to be of other people, whether they are metaphysical zombies or real phenomenological perspectives anchored in bodies, that's up to you to define. Or solipsism, they're not there at all. But the use of the word real world refers to the world of the sense data that we all encounter. So because you exist in the real world, you're able to make fictional worlds, like writing a book. Tolkien existed in the real world, and he made a fictional world, right? And a virtual world is a world created in technology. That's the way I use the word. When I say a virtual world, I mean a world like World of Warcraft, or some form of online chat room, or VR chat. It's a world in the sense that the axioms that make up its rules are self-contained, and it's virtual. It's built in something that is technologically mediated to be virtual. I don't necessarily philosophically, in that video, in the introduction video, I didn't specify them more closely, because there wasn't a need in that video to delve into what is virtual. Like, does it have to be based on bits or pixels or code? Like, that wasn't a question in that sense. But yeah, you could argue that something mediated by a more primary technology like Magic the Gathering cards could technically be virtual, because it's not exclusively fictional, in the sense that it's not just words or verbal resuscitation of a story. Okay, so that's some brief outlines or some brief clarifications of what those definitions are. Simon goes on to say, I find the difference between the fictional and the real can become slippery. That is up to you depends on how you define fictional and real. There's certainly a lot of overlap, and anyone who spent a lot of time in a fictional world, like binge watching a Netflix series or playing a game 20 hours a day for an extended period, will find their REM sleep cycle and their waking thoughts becoming more and more preoccupied with the problem solving of that fictional world. But I've never met someone who wasn't psychotic or like the sensory apparatus and the cognitive apparatus was. I've never met individuals who had undisturbed cognitive apparatus that were unable to discern the difference between, okay, I am in the real world buying my groceries, and now I'm back in my apartment engaging in the fictional or virtual world. That line is pretty clear for me. Now that's just the way I see it, and I can sympathize with people who translate their own world narratively, exclusively, or to such an extent that the fictional begin to meld with the stories that they tell themselves about reality. And Simon James goes on to make that point here when he asks, wasn't that Campbell's point? Not necessarily for me. Campbell's point was that we emulate the evolutionary history of our genetic expressions. We express them in the fictional world. Like the hero's journey is the archetypal story of man going out to confront the unknown. It's a genetic blueprint expressed in story. That doesn't mean that real and fictional blurs. It just means that we tell fictions based on our real experiences. Fictional and real can only really blur if you consider fictional worlds unconnected to the real world. The way I see it is you can only really tell fictions if you exist. And you can't exist in a world without worlds obtaining some form of contingent primacy. Like, you can exist in a vacuum, no world, no rules, no time, nothing. Existence could theoretically be, conceived of that way. But once you get to the point of just laws of physics and biology and self-aware beings engaged in that real world, they're gonna call whatever world that is real. They're gonna invent a word or a concept for primary value. So that's what I mean with the real world. And because we're biological creatures existing here, we can make fictional worlds, and those fictional worlds can be represented virtually. So that's what I mean by that's my definitions. Can a virtual world so back to the earlier point. I find the difference between the fictional and the real can become slippery. I don't have a clever answer here. If you feel they can become slippery, that might be you. That might be down to the way you define real and fictional. If you use them as I use them, they're pretty clearly divided. People tell themselves fictions about themselves all the time, if that's what you mean. Like, I'm successful when you're really not, or I'm competent when I'm really not, or I'm likable when I'm really not. Those kinds of fictions, sure, but the real world is not contingent on your story of it. Like, the real world is just real. Like this bottle cork hitting this wall. That is that doesn't need a fictionalized story from you to occur, or from me. Now you could say I did the action anchored in a narrative understanding of events. Like, if I explain concept X to person Y by using the action Z, then some future event is likely to occur. Yeah, that is a fictional story until it happens to occur. But unless you're talking very specifically about cognitive networks, narratives, and yeah, the narrative reality that we occupy as fictional. Unless you're talking about that in that very specific sense, I don't see a blurring. If you mean fictional worlds as in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and our real world blending, I don't see that happening a lot, no. Okay. Can a virtual world include no fiction and no reality? That is a good question. Yes. It can include no fiction. You can have a virtual world like a virtual space, like you put on a VR headset. You enter a completely white world, white everywhere, but you can move, and there's some form of floor. There wouldn't be a lot of fiction there. There might be narratives of explanatory value, like you're an individual or an entity searching for patterns, but no fiction in the sense of Tolkien. There's no dwarves or myths or events or stories there. It's just blank nothingness. So I would say there's no fiction in that virtual world. Now, would it be a meaningful virtual world? Not likely. I mean, not a lot of people would connect to this white world. If they did connect and formed a community and started, engaging each other in this bland, meaningless space, then sure, you could have fiction. Yeah, you can have fictional adventures or memes or enactments if they were dressing their avatars accordingly. Sure. Can a virtual world include no reality? No. Well, it can include no reality in itself because it's not real. It's anchored in reality. The technology that it's used, the technology that generates the virtual world, like the VR headset, is anchored in reality. Like it really exists. You can, I don't know, touch the headset. I don't know what criterion you would use to establish ontological realness. A separate question. We already assume that the real world is the one given by the senses. Whatever you make of the validity of the sense data, that's on you. But my use of the word real means this world. Can a virtual world include no fiction? Sure. And no reality. Yeah, it can include... Well, it can't include reality. You can't generate a new reality-based fictional world. Because it would always be simulated, no matter how close you got it. Even if you created a new Big Bang inside a virtual world, it would still be anchored in this reality. So it wouldn't generate its own new reality. Can a virtual world include no fiction? Yeah. And no reality? Yes. A virtual world can include no fiction and no reality. No reality because it can't generate its own. It has to be anchored in ours. And no fiction because, well, you can theoretically do that. Yeah, there's a scope for paper in here. Sure. I feel like it will be a short paper if you share my perspective, because there's not a whole lot to write unless you want to get really technical about fictional, as in cognitive narratives about our worlds, about ourselves. Is the self a fiction? Like that kind of thing, you could do that. In terms of virtual world and reality, I don't know. I don't want to beat the old horse to death that virtual worlds represent the brain in a vat, evil deceiver of Descartes, philosophical thought experiment. They do. How do you know that the world you're seeing is real? And that's a really good question. But there's not a lot more to say. Virtual worlds provide a neat framing device for the ontological demon of Descartes. And end script. I haven't found anything new to say. You'd have to go into how technology mediates our perception phenomenologically, and that might be useful. And people are doing that. But in terms of metaphysics, it's just like the movie Matrix was just a new example of brain in a vat. Didn't add much to that metaphysical conundrum. Okay, without these clear definitions, what are we really talking about? Yes. If you didn't have the clear definitions that I had in going into my first video, then it would seem like a lot of blur. Yeah. No, my specific outlining was that people who engage in fictional worlds, virtual fictional worlds like MMORPGs, like role-playing games online, they use the success of those games is due to emulating the real world, that our real environment, trade systems, social systems, competition, etc., and that mastery in those fictional virtual realms could translate into mastery in the real world. Like, you could become more socially adept and then go out and get a real job and maybe even a girlfriend or something like that. So yeah, and the fact that we found those fictional worlds so narratively meaningful for ourselves, especially technologically, like the stimulus of the technology and the link between the Campbellian hero's journey and our own lives playing out online, that was the general outline of the theory of virtual worlds. So I hope that explains more than it obfuscates, and please add comments and feedback. I love this process. Love engaging with you and whoever else may be watching in the future. So thank you for watching. Please don't subscribe, don't share, and don't like these videos, because I don't know what I would do with the exposure. Thank you. Bye.